Well, thanks for joining us for this Lunch and Learn program. Feel free to eat while I'm talking. That's the whole point. You don't have to, of course. It's not mandatory lunch and learn. It's just optional. What we're going to be talking about today is science and society. We've gone through a period where the disconnect between the scientific establishment and popular knowledge, acceptance, obedience, maybe, have really had quite a gulf. And it'd be interesting for us to evaluate both why that's the case and perhaps what we can do about it if we think that it's a major problem. Part of the fundamental disconnect between science and society is that at its basis, science is based on what makes sense. You observe something that happens, you investigate it, you collect evidence about what happened, you speculate what could have caused this to happen, what's the mechanism that makes this behave a certain way, and then you try to do it again in different circumstances to test if your guess of what's causing it to happen is actually what's causing it to happen. You know, you might think, for example, that the natural state of any object is at rest. Because I dropped this phone, I'm not going to actually do that, but if I drop this phone, it's going to come to a stop. If I push it along the table, it's going to slide for a bit and then it's going to stop. So maybe the natural state of objects is to stop. But then when you experiment a bit more, you put some oil on the table, you put wheels that have been greased under the object, you realize that what's causing it to stop are other forces that are working against the momentum of the object. And then you truly get an understanding of how momentum, inertia, force, and all that works. So you have to investigate, and you have to try and do it again and again and be able to repeat it. There's actually been a story in the news lately about a research team that claims to have found what they call cold fusion. Now, cold fusion isn't actually cold. I mean, we in Chicago know what cold is, but the idea is it's relatively close to room temperature, unlike fusion in a nuclear reaction or fusion in the sun, which is happening at thousands of degrees. Cold fusion is happening in relatively room temperature conditions, but it would still release a huge amount of energy. And it could be a wonderful energy source. However, previous examples of cold fusion, the first one I recall happened in the 1980s, have been unrepeatable. They try to repeat the findings of this particular experiment using the exact same procedures, and it just doesn't work. So if you can't reproduce it, if you can't demonstrate again that this is what happens, then it just doesn't apply. That's the whole point, is that science should make sense. You should be able to see what happens, explain why it happens, repeat it again, and, you know, lather, rinse, repeat. And that's how science works. But sometimes the conclusions that science comes to after years of study and in-depth investigation don't make a lot of sense. For example, you and I and every object in the world are mostly empty space. It might be the space between atoms, but we think of ourselves as solid. You know, this is what makes sense. I'm solid here. This table, this computer is solid, but it's actually mostly empty space. We share 96% of our DNA with chimpanzees. And that's not shocking, given that their behavior patterns and their hair patterns and their mobility, opposing thumbs. I mean, there's a lot of features we have in common with chimpanzees. So 96% of DNA in common, that makes sense. We also share 60% of our DNA with chickens. Now, we might think that's okay, 60%, maybe 2/3, okay, they have heartbeats and they have, you know, internal body temperatures and they have a brain of some kind. But we also share 60% of our DNA with fruit flies. We even share 60% of our DNA with bananas. That sounds bananas. How could we share over half of our DNA with a fruit? It turns out that the basic functions of a carbon-based organism cover almost half of our genetic material. But that doesn't sort of make sense with our sense of self. It feels odd to be over half related to a banana. The Earth is 4 billion years old. And the first human evolutionary ancestor appeared approximately 4 million years ago that we have evidence of. But what that means, if the Earth is 4 billion years old, and the earliest ancestor of humanity is 4 million years ago, 99.9% of the time the world has existed has been without any version of us. And again, that doesn't conform to our sense of self. We like to think we're more important than that. You know, if you drew a timeline of the world, we are, you know, a hair on the end of the timeline, let alone recorded civilization, which we think is really long. But in fact, we are a blip on this long timeline of life, and that doesn't make sense to our experience. After all, if you extend the view even wider, we are a dot in a corner of a vast universe. There are these posters that they sell that have a picture of the Milky Way galaxy and an arrow pointing to one little dot that says, "You are here." It's us in the context of the galaxy. And, you know, we sent out these Voyager probes in 1977. They've been traveling for 46 years, 30,000 miles an hour. They are currently 15 billion miles away. We recently managed to reconnect with one of them, and we accidentally pointed the antenna the wrong way and managed to reconnect. So we're still talking to both of those probes that are still running on low power 46 years out. A wonderful achievement. But 15 billion miles away in two different trajectories. And what else is out there? How much further is it going to go? There's a new controversy du jour of UFOs. What does the government know? And what have they been hiding? Well, it's just one more example of us being a dot in the vast universe and not being able to handle it, to think that in all of the galaxies, in all of the worlds, that aliens came to find us because we're that important or interesting. And finally, it doesn't make sense on a rational level that you would want to get sick on purpose. That if you get yourself a little sick with a particular disease on purpose, it prevents you from getting sick later on. Now, this is the basic principle behind vaccination. You get yourself with an attenuated version of the disease, and it prevents you from having a worse case later. But that doesn't seem to make sense on a first glance. So common sense and what science tells us are sometimes very different about whether we are physically solid, how long the Earth has lived, vis-a-vis our experience of it, and so on. Now, why is it that people don't tend to listen to science? Well, there's a few possible factors. I'll run a few of them for you. First, I'll ask you, when was your last science class? Probably high school, maybe college.
Freshman year of college.
Well, I took lots of math through graduate school for the first time, but science per se would have been probably sophomore year in college.
I think mine would have been junior or senior year of college. I took a class just to fulfill a requirement on the science of everyday objects. So like how a quartz watch works and how a microwave works and things like that. And then I also took intro bio just because I wanted to push myself against the pre-meds. So, but that's my senior year of college. That's quite a long time ago, 26 years for me. So I haven't had a class. I read articles and I watch videos or see movies, that you can learn in other ways than being in class. What do you remember from, let's just go to high school. What do you remember from your high school science classes?
Nothing.
The names of them.
I remember
biology,
something.
physics, and chemistry.
Yeah, I took all three of those too.
Yeah, I remember stuff.
Yeah, I remember the demonstrations in physics. Physics was a fun class because he would show you how things work. We'd use model rockets to talk about force, and you had this huge slinky we used to talk about wave motion. And so I remember the visuals. Those were catchy. But in general, when you're doing science in high school, you're not really doing science because you're not experimenting for things you don't know. you're doing a demonstration. If I do this thing and I do that thing, it should result in this. I write up a lab report that explains what happened, but it's not a surprise to the teacher what you come up with, unless you did something really, really wrong. So it's actually not that interesting because you're just jumping through a hoop. You're learning you're learning to do this to get the same result that everybody has. And that is part of science, the repeatable, the confirmation, but it's not the same. And all too often science class goes down with a reputation of being boring. It's a lot of memorizing. It's not so fun. I'm dissecting this fetal pig or this rat, but I have to memorize all these pieces, and it's just a lot of work, and it smells terrible. The aesthetic of the experience, the emotion of the experience is not one that would lead you to enjoy it. Certainly for people who aren't scientifically inclined. And just because we're using Zoom or I have a cell phone here, that doesn't mean I know science. That's using technology. It's not the same as doing science, inventing something. Now, a second reason why people might not be interested in science or not listen to the science is that for some people, science is like speaking another language. Many years ago, a Harvard professor came up with the idea of multiple intelligences or multiple learning styles. And the theory was, this is Howard Gardner was his name, the theory was that different people were smart and learned in different ways. So some people are more verbally intelligent. They speak, they read, that's how they learn. Some people are more mathematically, logically, or scientifically inclined, and that's where their expertise is. Some people are more spatial or visual learners. A bar graph or a pie chart is much more useful for them than a table of data. Some people are kinesthetic learners. They have, dance skills or athletic skills or movement skills where they probably, couldn't diagram a sentence, but they can do an amazing thing physically that the person who can diagram a sentence could never imagine doing. And some people are even interpersonally intelligent. I mean, I'm sure we've all known people who were, not skilled in the classroom, but understood people very well and were able to be successful sometimes in life because of their interpersonal intelligence. Now, this would provide a ready explanation for why many people don't like science, because their brain just doesn't work that way very well. And they're much more comfortable in athletics or in a verbal setting or a musical setting than they would be in a science class. But the problem is, here's where science sort of pokes a hole in our balloon. There's actually not a lot of evidence for that theory of multiple intelligences. It kind of rings true to the human experience, but when they've tried to demonstrate this or figure out which part of the brains are working differently, and they've been unable to reproduce it, or even to get a sense of what proportion of the population is which kind of learner and so on, it hasn't been proven to be real, even if it resonates. But however you understand it, some people get science and some people don't. Just like some people are good dancers and some people are terrible dancers. Some people are gifted in athletics and some are not. Some are talented musicians or have a wonderful ear. Some people know how to pack a suitcase, and other people are hopeless trying to pack a suitcase. Whether it's visual spatial intelligence or something else, we have different skills, and some of us are not scientifically inclined. Now, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is with understanding and accepting science is that we like to think that our reasoning mind is in charge of making choices. But there's a wonderful metaphor for this that the psychologist of ethics, Jonathan Haidt, writes about in his book, The Righteous Mind. He says, the rational mind is like a human being riding an elephant. The elephant are our impulses, our emotions, our non-rational actions. And so if you picture a person riding an elephant, can the person make the elephant go in a certain direction? Sometimes, if the elephant is willing to take suggestions. But can the elephant bull through whatever the human being wants it to do? Of course. So all too often, our emotions, our biases, our subconscious thought processes are driving the show. And the human being is coming up with reasons to explain why the elephant did what it did. So it's pretending it's in charge. But it's really saying, oh, I meant to do that. Yes, we wanted to go walk through that field and trample that fence. That was all part of the plan. Well, unfortunately, that makes it hard for us to evaluate evidence, to come to conclusions. We have all kinds of cognitive biases that affect our ability to come to reasonable conclusions, to look at evidence. There are logical fallacies we fall into all the time, assuming there must be one unified cause behind something, assuming that things have to make sense as we understand them. And sometimes we reject a truth that would challenge who we are. If a particular conclusion would undermine our sense of self or our sense of group identity, we will resist it because the cost of accepting that is higher than the cost of denial. Think about cult behavior when people are waiting for the UFOs to pick them up and take them away. And the date comes that they've been promised and nothing happens. Researchers have found that people will leap to any conclusion possible other than I was wrong. We were wrong. They'd much rather jump to something else. Oh, your Messiah died? He was actually resurrected. Or he will be in the future, if you want to talk Lubavitch or Chassids. So you'll come to any kind of radical conclusion rather than admit that you were wrong and that your system of thought was wrong and that your belief system was wrong. That's a very hard conclusion to come to for many people. Haidt describes at one point the difference between can I believe something and must I believe something. If you find evidence that supports what you already believe, then you'll be willing to believe it, even if it's kind of flimsy. You'll say, can I believe this? Like, is there any shred of evidence that can lend me to say, yes, this is proving what I think? Whereas if information comes that undermines what you believe or who you are, then you're in the mode of, must I believe this? Is there any way I can get out of believing in this? And, or do I have, am I forced to accept it even though I don't want to? This comes out on both sides of the political aisle, by the way. You know, we like to project and assume, well, our enemies are the ones who do this. Well, this happens on both sides. A study was done once where they got a group of people who self-identified as gun control supporters and another group who self-identified as gun rights supporters, pro-Second Amendment. And they gave the people who were pro-gun control a report that demonstrated that gun control was not effective. They gave the gun rights people a report that showed that gun control was effective. They then asked these groups, what did the report that you read actually say? And the gun control people said, it confirms that gun control works, even though the report was written to be the opposite. And the gun rights people said, it proves that gun control does not work, even though the report they were given suggested the opposite. They didn't even read what was there, or they wouldn't accept it because they were saying, must I accept this? And they didn't want to. I think about the debates we had through the pandemic over wearing a mask. And it was one of these cases where it became an irrational debate, not about what the evidence suggests. It became a totem of identity, even beyond the point for those people who said they were following the science to actually be following the science. I saw people walking on paths outside with masks on, long after we knew that when you're outside, you didn't need to be wearing a mask because of the diffusion of particles and so on. I know people that quarantined their mail months after we were told you no longer need to worry about object-borne pathogens for the COVID virus. And they would say things like, well, I'm just being extra careful. What does it hurt? And, it's a sign of respect to other people. They would come up with rationalizations for continuing the behavior that wasn't justified by the science. In fact, my son's summer camp was a one-week camp focused on critical thinking and science. And last year they had the students wearing masks all the time, I saw a picture of a kid that was posted on the Facebook group that showed a kid on a zip line wearing a mask. And this was not summer of 2020. This was last summer. And one of the parents commented, "I'm so glad you're following the science." And there was part of me that wanted to say, that's not really the science. I decided it wasn't worth the Facebook argument. But it was one of those cases where even people who claim to follow the science sometimes have limitations. I remember also there was a controversy maybe 15 years ago. A researcher came out with a finding that many people are aware that women go through a fertility decline around age 35. That it's harder to get pregnant after that age on average across the population. This researcher came out with a study that suggested that there's also a fertility decline at age 25. That was very controversial, not because his data was skewed, but because what would the social consequences be? It means women couldn't get careers before they have kids. It would change their calculus of what their life trajectory would be. It would make a big difference. And so people objected to the conclusions, not based on the facts or the analysis, but based on the social effects, on the consequences, on their sense of self. So we fall into this trap of must I believe it versus can I believe it? People jump to the can I believe solutions, conspiracy thinking all the time. But must I believe it, unfortunately, is the way science works, and it's not the way our brain works. We are a human riding an elephant, and it's tough to control. Another challenge to science and science literacy is that science is often uncertain. They'll use phrases like "as best we know" or "evidence suggests," and the answers change all the time. A lot of people like things to be black and white, yes or no, good or bad, what do I do, and then give me clear rules. Certainly people who tend to a more conventional religious approach want there to be clear rules, yes and no, black and white, in and out, us and them, good and bad. But that's also how sometimes all of us work. But when science is changing its understanding over time, and it takes a long time to figure out exactly what the best conclusion is, you're going to get conflicting answers on the origins of the COVID virus, on whether masks are effective and what kind of masks are effective. In my house, we just put in for fabric recycling this whole pile of cloth masks that we have. Because in the first 3 months of the pandemic, they said cloth masks are fine, use cloth masks. It turns out cloth masks were not fine. And it also turns out, this is the sad part, that some people knew that cloth masks weren't fine. But they said cloth masks were fine to avoid a run on KN95 masks, which they needed for hospital workers. So it's like this quintessential example of the justified lie. The hospital workers are being exposed in much greater numbers, at much greater risk to their own health during the dark days of the COVID epidemic in March, April, May in 2020. And they wanted to preserve the KN95 masks they could acquire for that population, for the workers. But that meant telling the general populace something that wasn't true. And then when it came out that it wasn't true, the end result was a loss in trust. Because some people said, well, if they lied then they're lying now. And that was, I think, it was sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But the loss of trust, I think, in the long run proved to be just as damaging as the risk of mask shortages in those first few months. Another approach that's a challenge is that not just science changes gradually, we learn at times slowly, but sometimes there's what they call a paradigm shift, where a new theory or a new approach shows up and things change rapidly, like the development of mRNA vaccines. This is a very different approach to vaccines, and it's proven effective in a number of treatments, but it only developed recently. And it's such a different approach. People are afraid of how fast the change is. The same thing happened in the 1950s and 60s when they came up with plate tectonics for geology, which was a very different theory than the original version of geology. But It was the paradigm shift that made sense. Just like the Earth in the center of the universe versus the Earth orbiting the sun, everything changes, but sometimes it's a step forward. We have to also understand, this is dramatized clearly by the Oppenheimer movie, if nothing else, that science is neither good nor bad. Science is a tool. Understanding the structure of the atom is vital for all kinds of positive work. Understanding radioactivity has enabled chemotherapy, radiation therapy, magnetic imaging, all kinds of wonderful advances, but it's also created nuclear weapons and fallout and nuclear waste and these other challenges and core meltdowns like Chernobyl. Science is a tool, and we have to understand that tools are used by people. This is one of our earliest features, is our ability to make tools and use tools, sometimes to help and sometimes to hurt. In the news just in the past week, there was a settlement reached with the family of Henrietta Lacks. I don't know if you've ever heard of Henrietta Lacks, but you've absolutely benefited from her life and more specifically from her death. She was a Black woman who lived in Baltimore, and she went to the Johns Hopkins hospital because she was dealing with, I believe it was cervical cancer. And the doctors there managed to harvest some of her cells, her cancer cells, which proved to be fantastic at reproducing and surviving in Petri dishes, where they had not been able to find a cell line they could develop to reproduce indefinitely. This particularly aggressive cancer was successful at doing so. Henrietta herself died in 1951, but her cells lived on, labeled as HeLa cells, H-E-L-A. And many people never knew that HeLa stood for Henrietta Lacks. They figured it was some kind of artificially developed something. But by having a lot of the same cells, you can test different treatments on them and see how they react. It enables all kinds of medical advances before you get to the stage of trying it in live organisms. It has led to huge advances in science, great income from pharmaceutical companies and so on. Just this past week, a particular research firm reached a deal with the Henrietta Lacks family to provide some compensation to them because there was no consent given when these cells were taken. And the family itself has very limited access to medical care at the time and in decades since. You know, the problem with unequal medical access is that for some poor populations, they felt that the hospital kills you because you go to the hospital too late, they treat you as best they can, and you die anyways. If they had a primary care physician, if you had easy access to basic medical screening, as is in the case in many other Western countries, you could catch a lot of these problems much earlier, and that would lead to much better health outcomes. But if you don't have that equal medical access, you become suspicious of the medical establishment. And there are plenty of examples where the medical establishment did terrible things. Around the same time period as Henrietta Lacks was getting her cells taken and used, an experiment was going on in Tuskegee with syphilis, where Black men who had been infected with syphilis were studied for the progression of the disease while they were not being given treatments that were known to be effective. It was allowed to progress. And we don't have to go beyond the Jewish experience and what happened to Jews in certain concentration camps during the Holocaust, where they also were experimented on as live, non-consensual subjects. Those were scientists doing those experiments. So if people doubt science or don't automatically trust scientists, maybe it's not out of nowhere. And finally, science is complicated. Scientists themselves don't agree on everything. I'll give you one example. 2 years ago, I decided to purchase an electric car. Does not burn any gasoline. And you hear arguments online on both sides of this debate. Are electric cars good for the environment or bad for the environment? The reality is that there's a piece of both. On one hand, they don't burn fossil fuels, so they don't release carbon dioxide, they don't release pollutants that cause respiratory issues. They don't feed oil companies, they don't feed oil kleptocracies like Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iran. On the other hand, electric cars require a large number of rare earth minerals to make the batteries. They actually produce more in emissions when you're making an electric car than you would making a gas car. The rare earth minerals come from terrible countries sometimes too, like the Congo and other places, and cause their own environmental impact with the process of mining. And you may understand that electricity doesn't come from magic. How do you make the electricity? Well, in a lot of places, you burn coal. So if you need more electricity to run your car and you're burning coal, is that different than burning gas? When you actually run the numbers out, electric cars are better for the environment than a gas car, but not by as much as you might assume. And there are ways you can make it better. So one thing we did was we put solar panels on our house, so that when my car is home during the day, I'm charging it from the sun, not from the coal-fired power plant. Over the length of time, cars tend to last longer. They have fewer moving parts that will break. So the car lasting longer has a better environmental impact. It is cheaper to run on electricity in most states. If you're in Hawaii and electricity is very expensive, or California, it may be a challenge. But in California, gas is expensive too. So it works out in that respect. In the end, you have to do the math, and it's a long process to figure out. And in the end, it works out, but it's not a slam dunk. It's not easy. And some people just don't have the patience for things that aren't easy. You know, they want to watch a show where there's a villain and a hero, and when it's mixed, it's hard. So at this point, I want to stop and ask you, what do you think about my ideas of why people don't listen to science? Which do you think is more challenging? Is there something I didn't mention? And then we can turn to talking a little bit about what we can do to improve scientific literacy. So what do you think about some of those factors I mentioned?
Well, I think that you touched on it, but there's probably an entire hour's conversation about the politicization of science, because that, you know, there's a mental, psychological trigger that engages people in their biases based on their politics, that leads them away from the scientific mind and into the political/religious belief mind, with, you know, remarkable.
But it's not always religious belief. There are people who are convinced that they know the science better than the scientists from a secular perspective. They're looking at other alternatives. They're getting beyond the establishment. Anti-vaccination thought is not only on the far right. There's also people on the far left who are suspicious of big industry and big pharmaceuticals, and so they come to it from a different political perspective, but wind up in the same skeptical of science position.
Absolutely. I mean, I just think my observation is that it can't be understated how the political polarity and the passion about it leads people to doubt science, to doubt expertise, even more now perhaps than in recent past.
I think that I agree absolutely. People want to be in their comfort zone. And if they have ideas, if they have expectations, they will look to confirm them. It's partly confirmation bias, and we want to build on what we have. We don't want anything that causes us to change. Change is very threatening. We always know that. And there's another point. The other thing is change is threatening, but so is uncertainty. And science is about uncertainty. It's not so much about, this is one of my favorite lines, it's not so much about answering questions as it is questioning answers. And the paradigm shift that you state, frequently what it has to do with is when an old way of looking at things breaks. It no longer answers the questions. It no longer even allows you to frame the relevant questions. That's when you have to take a leap and go someplace else. That kind of change and the kind of uncertainty that it represents is very threatening to most people. So they want to stay with what they know. They want to stay on the side they already are comfortable about. And they certainly don't want you moving the goalposts and changing the shape of the game. We're very
Right.
much of habits and comfort zones. And when we teach science in schools, we don't do a good job of communicating that it's the approach to inquiry and it's the willingness to try to make things make sense. We teach it as a bunch of knowns, and then when it becomes unknown, that leads to doubt. When you asked about our high school experience of science, and believe me, mine was much longer ago than yours, most of what I learned in high school biology in terms of classification isn't really accepted in the same way it was, or in the way it was presented. People are very, very different and talking differently about the classifications of life forms. We were taught plant and animal. And yeah, there were other things that were ignored for the simplification, which didn't help. So all that is a part of where the resistance comes from, I think.
Look, we thought dinosaurs were lizards. That's in my lifetime, when they're actually the ancestors of birds.
Really?
Yeah, the chicken is closer to a dinosaur than modern lizards are.
Actually, I'm a at Johns Hopkins, so I'm being a little bit ironic.
Yes, but that's science knowledge changes and the past changes, but that's unsettling for people, and it's tough to.
Yale. He probably visited Yale when you were there too.
Although, yeah, well, the problem is that they have these beautiful painted scenes of what people imagined the prehistoric world was like in the 1920s. And so when they go into disrepair or they begin to fade, the question is, do you restore them when they're inaccurate in a science museum, or do you relocate it to the art museum? But what do you do with old knowledge? It's like all those old encyclopedias that people have, they want to donate somewhere. But do you really want to put into a school library something that says someday man will walk on the moon? It's just not useful.
No, it's got to say someday woman will walk on the moon.
Yeah.
I'm trying to bolster your point, not challenge it.
I hear.
Sorry, real quick. Yeah, I do think that there's something to maybe science education. Not just how far back it is for most people, but obviously there's a lot of religious education. A lot of places are moving away from that, whether it's a religious education and maybe doesn't include it, but also even as compared to some other countries around the world, right? We have maybe in high school you get a year of biology and a year of chemistry and a year of physics. In some places you could get several years of that. And I'm not sure at the end of that whether most people really, how much they end up understanding. So for a lot of people, the debate over science it's sort of an appeal to authority, right? So it becomes, well, this PhD or this doctor says this, and they seem like you like them, they seem nice enough, so therefore, I'm going to believe it. How could you question this person? And so obviously, nobody's, right? We're not going to understand, the same as somebody who's spent their life studying, nuclear physics or whatever. But it would certainly be helpful to have some more of a basic understanding of, scientific concepts.
Right.
And that's an interesting point you're making. And I don't have anything on my phone to know who was just speaking. Can you tell me?
His name is Daniel.
Oh, hi. Thank you. The other thing is, what we learn in the grades, what we learn in school, there's really two different things, and they're not always compatible. We need to develop an understanding of what is the state of understanding. And we kind of get some of that in a selective way. But then what Rabbi Adams pointing out is we're not really being taught scientific method and scientific process and experimentation, because that's a different order of study. And we've kind of got them merged, and maybe that's part of where our misunderstanding comes from. We definitely need to develop a certain kind of scientific literacy, just like we need to develop writing skills, we need math skills, we need reading skills, we need an understanding of how we think things work.
Well,
Some
here's the
people don't
challenge.
agree.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge though is, we're always finding a balance between general knowledge, just to be an educated person, and specialized knowledge that you need for your career and your career path, and also what you're interested in. If I had to take 4 years of math in college, I would have hated it. I took one math class in college. I hated it because it was 3D graphing and vectors and tangents. And it was the spatial part. I always hated, I was much worse at geometry than I was at algebra because of the spatial side of things. I was terrible at packing suitcases for a long time. So if I had to take 4 years of math in college, I would have resented it. It wouldn't have created a positive experience at all, no matter how good the teachers were. So we have to sort of draw the line at some point where, okay, you've got enough in every field. Now you can specialize in what you want to do. And I was more interested in history and Jewish studies and languages and things like that. And I don't know what the right line is. I don't know that multiple years beating your head against the wall of physics is going to be helpful for people who are planning to become lawyers or are planning to become auto mechanics. I mean, I guess for the auto mechanics, certainly the engineering would be useful, but maybe not the biology. So that's the balancing act we have to have of interest, time, money. I mean, these are all factors that we can't do everything for everyone. But Susie, I think you're right that part of the goal is getting the concept of science and sort of an experience of the joy of it. You talk to people, or you hear speeches by people like Bill Nye, who's a public science educator, or even Richard Dawkins, who does a lot of public science work in addition to his humanism work. And Dawkins was once asked, if you don't believe in a heaven, how can you get up in the morning? And he said, that's why I get up in the morning. If this is the only world that there is, and I only have my 80 or so years to learn about what's in the world, I want to do it all the time. And so the excitement of discovery, and that's the positive plug. And there are talented science communicators out there. There are wonderful documentaries that reach through the noise, that touch people. You may remember the March of the Penguins 25 years ago was a big deal when that came out and everybody saw it. So there are ways that you can break through, but it's definitely a challenge. And what Mark was saying earlier about the political allegiance deafening people to listen to these things is definitely true. So here's one suggestion I have to make science more palatable. You need to use more religious people to promote science. Because if people see science as science versus religion, evolution versus their Christianity, then they're not going to listen. Because if they accept anything on the science side, they're undermining their Christianity, which they think is basic to themselves, being a good person, what the cosmos and God wants of them. They're not going to listen. But if you get someone who is a minister, who is a self-labeled Christian, who says, I believe in evolution, I think that describes the world, that's very different. Because it doesn't make them surrender their fundamental identity to explore what the science has to say. I read once about a biology class that had a very smart assignment when they were entering their evolution unit. The teacher told all the students to go home and to ask their parents or their minister, rabbi, priest, what their religious tradition said about evolution. And when they came back to class, they shared the results of this. And the results were that it's not a science versus religion, it's religion versus religion, because some religions integrate evolution into their cosmology and their theology, and some reject it. So the point was made to the class that it's not that all Christians reject evolution, it's that some Christians reject evolution and some Christians accept it. Many years ago, there was an initiative started out as Evolution Sunday. And the idea was to get ministers to preach about evolution from their pulpits on Sunday mornings. They decided to become ecumenical and expanded to include Shabbat and Friday for Muslim prayers. So it's now called Evolution Weekend. And every year around the time of Darwin's birthday, congregations have programs on science literacy, evolution, and other subjects like that. to make the point to the members of these congregations that religion is not opposed to science. Some religions are opposed to science, but other kinds of religions are amenable to including that. Now, we're in a humanistic congregation. We're not conventionally religious in that theological supernatural sense, so we don't have that theoretical conflict even. We're generally fans of science with, understanding the human factors involved. But we still participate in the Evolution Weekend initiative because we want to support that response. The largest religious organization in the world that supports the teaching of evolution is the Catholic Church. Now, they were a little late apologizing to Galileo. It took them about 300 years to say, oops, we were wrong on that one. They were a little prompter in getting to Darwin, but they did and have said and consistently say that evolution is how humanity came to be. And they would describe Genesis as true on a spiritual level or some other kind of way, but not in a factual year-based system. And so if you say that science is only something for secular people to defend, you're missing out on a great way to promote science literacy and acceptance in the broader public, not all of which is secular. A second challenge we have to deal with head on is we have to address the historical and structural inequities with access to science and scientific experience. You don't deny it. You don't say science is wonderful, those were just some bad. No, you have to say science emerges from society. And if there are structural inequities and status and standing and acceptance as a full human being, then that's going to be played out in science too. I mean, some of the major advances in obstetrics in the 19th century were developed by a doctor who was working on slave women who were not consenting to his procedures. It's awful. But sometimes science has skeletons in the closet, and better to acknowledge them, to show that you're aware, and then be able to move forward than to say, well, science is fine, don't worry about it, no big deal. It is a big deal. And it also means opening up the doors to putting extra effort into communities that need it, whether they are racial minorities that have been discriminated against, or if they are rural communities, low-income communities of any particular racial or ethnic background that don't have access to hospitals, to good science education, to university campuses, and to public demonstrations of science. One of the reasons why many cities started out poorly in responding to COVID and then improved their response was that they put extra effort in reaching out to previously disadvantaged healthcare deserts and communities that were less well served. If they had taken a purely color, racial, income blind approach, they would not have addressed the inequities that were there to reduce the uneven rates of COVID infection and death in their communities. So we have to address those structural problems to science and medicine and their applications to be able to counteract what already is the case. I do think, as Daniel highlighted, that distrust of authority is in the air and the water right now. I mean, when you think about being in the air and the water, you're already into conspiracy thinking, right? What are they putting in the air? What are they putting in the water? Who are they? If you're an anti-Semite, it's the Jews. If you're an anti-globalist, it's the world conspiracy. If you're an anti-capitalist, it's big business, it's big pharma. They are the they. So there's no one consistent they that's part of these conspiracies because there's no one consistent conspiracy, but why should they have to agree? I mean, it was kind of odd to me to hear very liberal progressive people saying, I trust the pharmaceutical industry. Really? I mean, trust but verify maybe. But, industry is in business to be in business. There's a reason why they keep those patents for so long. And there's a reason why insulin is so expensive. These are not altruistic entities. So our distrust of authority, I mean, this goes back to Watergate, this goes back to the Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, you can, all the revelations that came out about John F. Kennedy, you can find all sorts of reasons why we don't trust authority the way we used to. But it's led to a less than willingness to take science on its face. After all, we all have these magic devices, and we can talk to Siri or we can talk to androids, Google, and we can use those powers to find out all kinds of information that may or may not be true, but it's information. And it's on the internet. So how bad could it be? In the end, it's a sign of our breakdown of social cohesion because we don't have accepted sources. Where is Walter Cronkite? You know, or as Simon and Garfunkel saying, where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Right? Where's the simple hero that everybody trusts? And they just don't exist anymore. We have to make do with partial knowledge and conflicting knowledge. So the last suggestion, and this is something that we can work on, even if we don't get people to listen to us directly, is we need to make sure the people in charge are listening to science. If you can't rely on convincing, sometimes you have to rely on compelling. And if the government requires vaccinations to attend public schools, more people will get them. They may have questions about it. They may have concerns about it. Those can be investigated. They can discuss them. We actually had our son on a slower vaccination schedule because he had a lot of allergies and other immune health issues. But we did that in consultation with our doctor. We did not consult Dr. Google. We consulted our actual doctor. But we want to make sure the people who are making the policies, who are making the rules, are listening to science. And there are a lot of organizations dedicated to doing this. You have the Union for Concerned Scientists. There's just one example that does both public education and lobbying to get people to listen to science and when they're making decisions for all of us. In our own movement, the Society for Humanistic Judaism has sponsored an organization called Jews for a Secular Democracy. And one of its core planks and issues that it addresses is this question of making decisions with science and not just with religious ideology or political theory. There's an organization called the National Center for Science Education, which works with schools and school districts to provide science-based learning and to support science-based learning in evolution and climate science and in other subjects. And they've done wonderful work for 30 plus years. And the most important thing we can do is to vote. Because if you ask your representative, your senator, both in the state and at the federal level, what's your perspective on A, B, and C scientific issues, make those issues that they realize you care about. And if you do have two candidates to choose from, and the breaking point is how well they're willing to listen to what science has to say, then maybe that's a breaking point for making a decision for column A or for column B. What do you think? Any other ideas? Things we can do to bolster science?
I don't have any more solutions. I have only more problems.
Well,
I say this, I'm afraid that some of the resistance is going to be impervious to these approaches. They're too wedded to their comfort zones and the results they want and their expectations that their religion that is so important to them is in opposition. I don't want to sound hopeless, and it's certainly nice to have three things to do rather than nothing, but I think that the issues are very, very serious and very frightening.
Actually, you mentioned Oppenheimer, and I'm not kidding about it. I think that Oppenheimer is a really important cultural moment because it's a very serious movie that takes the topic seriously, and millions of people are going to see it. Even they're not even being pulled entirely away by the pink, the flashy candy-coated pink movie on the other screen. And I think that the reason that movie is so important is because it portrays scientists as fallible human science machines. It does not provide a truth. It actually challenge, if you really watch it, you need to watch it more than once, it challenges the viewer to live with the idea that Oppenheimer was not a hero. he did things that he couldn't reconcile. The decisions he made and the things he did, it could be argued, would have been done by somebody else worse, but we're living with the consequences of it. And the way the science is presented in the movie is secondary to the way the ethics of science is considered in the movie. And I think that, you know, the answer may be somewhere in culture rather than in education, or politics, because politics is proving to be rather broken and worthless.
Yeah. Well, on that happy note.